our job is to be telling different stories and telling them as fairly as possible. For example, I felt during the protests that police stories weren't also being told. Now, I don't know if everybody did that or every station did that, but I felt as a senior person there, the wisdom I had was that there's more to what we're seeing there with the protests. Somebody on the other side of the protest is a wife, a husband, a sister, a brother, a father, and I'd like to hear some of their voices too.
This episode of the It's Needed podcast is brought to you in part by Thin Line Anthem. Thin Line Anthem is a vitamin and supplement brand created by first responders for first responders. Our job as first responders requires us to be both mentally sharp and physically capable, which is exactly why I take my Thin Line Anthem Omega-3 blend daily. I've been taking them for a week now and I can already tell a difference both mentally and physically. Make sure you check them out today at thinlineanthem.com and use promo code ITSNEEDED, all caps, no space, for 20% off your entire order. Again, thinlineanthem.com, promo code ITSNEEDED, 20% off your order. Hope you enjoyed today's episode.
Yo, what's going on? Welcome to another episode of the It's Needed podcast, where we discuss real issues involving law enforcement in the community. It's your boy, Ryan Tillman, founder of Breaking Barriers United, and I'm joined today by the light-skinned wonder himself, Mr. Oh No, It's the Popo.
Bam, 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 bam. What's up, brother? How you doing?
That is the mountain man, and he literally looks like, not only does he look like a mountain man today, but he is coming to us from the mountains today. Where are you at, AJ?
We are in the Smoky Mountains in Tennessee, so just so everybody knows, when we say we don't miss a recording of the podcast, we mean it. I brought all the studio equipment. We're here on vacation, coming to you live.
I will make sure you don't get a divorce after this podcast, I promise.
Oh, you said a what?
I make sure you don't get a divorce after this podcast, I promise.
Please do. Please do.
That's why, is that why you've been growing your beard out? So that way you can live in the mountains? Or you can because you're going to the mountains?
The likelihood of me getting a divorce increases the more I grow this beard out. My wife hates it. She absolutely hates it.
Well, I'm team your wife. You need to get rid of it. And we are joined. I have a special guest today. It's kind of weird. Fun fact about me is when I went to college, I was a journalism major. So, fun fact, I always wanted to go into journalism and be the guy behind the cameras and things like that. And lo and behold, I became a police officer. So the fun fact today, though, we have Christine Devine on, and she is a news anchor locally here in Southern California and has done some phenomenal work. I mean, she's a national figure to me. We were talking before we got on the podcast today, and I just kind of looked up to Christine. So thank you so much for joining us today, Christine.
Well, you kind of are like a journalist right now, aren't you?
I am a little bit. I feel a little bit of pressure, though. I feel a sense of pressure because I'm interviewing the interviewer.
Well, I feel the pressure because I don't like being interviewed. So
The roles are just all reversed today.
you're like, what am I going to say?
It's backwards day. So, but I can't thank you enough to, one, just coming on the podcast, and two, just, being willing to have some conversation and dialogue with us. And so I think it's important for our viewers and listeners out there, as an organization, as a podcast, our goal is always just to be able to have transparent conversations with each other for education and just to bring people together. And I get a sense right now in society, we're so divided, unfortunately. And the year of 2020 has been one, to say the least. So with the death of Kobe Bryant to start it off, which I know, and Christine, correct me if I'm wrong, but Kobe was a dear friend of yours because you've covered him through the years, correct?
Well, I don't think he would use the word dear friend. I do a segment with kids in foster care, and we take them to really cool locations for their news story. And the Lakers were always one of the places that we go. They'd have us come to Laker practice. And early on, they would bring Kobe over as the player to meet. This was like early on.
Wow.
Over the many years, we would get to know each other through the Wednesday's Child segment, or we did an event together for the homeless in the downtown area. So it's just kind of one of those things where I know you, you know me, and it's good like that.
That's very cool.
Yeah.
Well, I was watching some of the stories that you covered over him through the years, and I was just thinking, like, man, how much that, because if his death impacted me and AJ and the rest of the world, how much does it impact somebody that's covering him over the years and interviewed him over the years? And so yeah, you start 2020 off with that, and then you go on. Go ahead, Christine.
Let me back up, because I think the difference for me in covering the death of Kobe is being the anchor at Fox 11. I had to roll in right away to cover that breaking news. And I remember getting the call from my boss who said, there's been a helicopter crash. We think it's Kobe. Why don't you roll in? So I was the first on the air with that news. But for me, he wasn't necessarily a sports hero, because to me, he was a humanitarian. So that was my, if you're willing to give a kid in foster care your time and your love and your attention and the tennis shoes off your feet, you're a humanitarian.
Yeah.
I looked at the loss of that. I looked at the loss of the future of what could be when he was committed to girls' sports so much. I thought of the loss of the father that he was, spouse, the husband. So for me, it was kind of a different way to look at it than, my favorite basketball player.
Well, that's interesting to hear. And it's actually good to hear because, talking to somebody like you, to hear that you're seeing beyond just what everybody views Kobe Bryant as, because a lot of people view him as the basketball star he was, no doubt about it. But for you to be able to see beyond that is so important. And that's really what our organization and our podcast is about, is being able to see beyond the person. And, there's just been this whole idea within the media that, you have two sides, the left and the right, Fox, CNN, blah, 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 it goes back and forth. And, sometimes I think, AJ, do me a favor, tell your story about your friend out in Columbus, because I'm going to use that to tie it back into where I was going with what I was saying.
And let me respond to the CNN, Fox, and that thing. Go ahead, AJ.
Yeah. So when we first started recording the podcast, that was going on 2 years ago. We were having a conversation, and I forget what the incident was, but I seen something on the news, and I just felt personally attacked by the media in general. I said a blanket statement, and I said, you know what, the media doesn't favor the police or something to that effect, and I just kept going with it. It was real quick. I kept going with it. And there's a lot of local support here that listens to the podcast, follows my social media. So a news reporter actually reached out to me that listens to the podcast from here. And, he called me out and he said, hey, in one sentence, you say that you stand against putting blankets over careers and people. You fight against that in the police force, right? Like, you want to be the difference and you want to show people that you are the difference inside the force. But yet in the next sentence, you put a blanket statement over another profession. How is that any different? And it was a wake up call for me, because not only is this a friend of mine, but I also respect him professionally. So I immediately apologized, and Ryan and I had a conversation, and it was just an extreme wake up call for me.
Yeah, well, it is funny for me to hear even Ryan, whom I'm getting to know over the years through stories, and I'm so grateful that you come on our air, to hear your perspective on the media, just in the small comments you've made, setting this up. I feel like the media, our job, I'm a local newscaster. I'm not CNN, national cable, not Fox News Channel. I work for the local station, which is the Fox station. And our job is covering the city hall and the politics and the car crash and Kobe Bryant, things like that. So you have to differentiate between a local reporter and a talk show, a news talk show. And because there's this cable 24/7, it often is lumped into one.
Yeah.
But our job, and my training, old school, was that as much as possible, you don't know my bias or my position or my thought. And if you look at any of my postings, they're fairly generic, because I try not to bring the way I feel into my job, because one day I'm covering the police, and the next day I'm covering Black Lives Matter, and next day I'm covering, what's happening with the Antifa, whatever, just keeping it current. And my job is to cover those. So nobody's looking at me saying, you're coming at us like this with a position. Now, we're all human. I have my social teachings. I have my parents who taught me the lessons in life. So none of us are unbiased, but our job is to be telling different stories and telling them as fairly as possible. As a veteran journalist, I've tried to bring in the wider wisdom. And you speak of police stories, for example, I felt during the protests that police stories weren't also being told. And so I brought to the table many times different stories, such as Ryan story. I texted a bunch of officer friends that I have covered or worked with and said, I'd like to hear your perspective through all of this. Now, I don't know if everybody did that or every station did that, but I felt as a senior person there, the wisdom I had was that there's more to what we're seeing there with the protests. Somebody on the other side of the protest is a wife, a husband, a sister, a brother, a father. And I'd like to hear some of their voices too.
And I think that's why I've appreciated you so much, Christine, throughout, because I got to know you over the past couple of years. And I think that's why I've appreciated you so much, because it wasn't, I can tell right off the jump that this was not something that, hey, I'm going out there just to do, cover something that's what's popular out there. Is you want to actually get to know the people and hear the message. And I think one of the things you just brought up, which is so important, and it was actually eye-opening for me, is the differences, because I think unfortunately what society has done is it kind of lumps you into the same category, because although you work for the local station, there's still the Fox tied to it, or there's a CBS or ABC. And the reason I say that is because I talk to people all the time, whether it's police officer or not, and they don't know how to differentiate the local versus the like the talk show. And so when you start, your job is to bring forth local stories about local people or local issues from an unbiased perspective, which is phenomenal. And that's why, like I said, I appreciate it. But I don't think a lot of our audience or a lot of people know actually what the difference is between, how media covers things and what the agenda is per se.
Well, I want to get back to, because I really believe, and my co-maker feels the same way, that it's unfair to say unbiased, because we all have conditioning as a child. What did my
absolutely
believe and stand up for or not? And I think that my strength is that coming at society, I have a really broad picture of some things, being that, I don't know if you know this, but I had a foster brother, because my parents took in foster kids, adopted kids. He was adopted, who ended up committing some crimes and being incarcerated more than once.
Wow.
So I have that perspective of, my first encounter with a police officer was the police car coming to our house to bring my brother home.
Wow.
Oh, wow.
Breaking into the school bus yard. So that was in high school. And I think that my perspective is one of humanity, of somebody, why did they turn to committing crimes? Why did they feel, this person, a lack of self-worth? Well, this is a kid who was born in the system, born into, his mother was incarcerated. She was a teenage heroin addict. Grandma decided she couldn't keep him. So how much pain did this child have as he's walking his walk in life? And then he's thrust into our home, a bunch of strangers. So long story short, but I think you can see that I might have some different perspectives on police, for example, or policing, or the way people are treated, people of color are treated.
Of course.
Myself, my brother also, he was Latino. He's passed away now. But I think he felt maybe he got perhaps a rougher situation with police. So I try to look at, everyone has a story, and let's look at the stories on many sides. And
I think that's what we've talked about. And AJ and I have talked about that over the years is, and you're absolutely right, because everybody has their bias, implicit, explicit bias. We all have our own biases based off of our stories growing up. And I think that's kind of what makes us people in general. And I think that's what the beauty of people is being able to have our differences and have the experiences that basically pull our life together, and being able to, jive off of one another because of the differences. I think, but unfortunately what's going on right now, and correct me if I'm wrong, AJ, you can add to this, is that we've allowed our differences to divide us. And I'm so gung-ho on, it's okay to be different. I've been having this discussion a lot lately, is I feel like in society, we've gotten to a place where the moment you say something that's contrary to what I say, is I'm going to shut my ears off and I'm going to stop listening to you. And, we talk about systematic racism and things like that. Like, as a black man in America, there's certain things that, like you said, Christine, that I've experienced growing up that has given me a certain, perspective on things that, if you didn't grow up that way, you don't understand where I'm coming from, but it doesn't mean you discount what I'm saying or say it doesn't exist. And I think that's the unfortunate part about where we're at right now is that if you say anything that's a little different than what I like to hear or want to hear, I'm not going to listen to you because that's not what I believe, or that's not a fitting to what I want to say. Go ahead, AJ, because I see you writing notes.
Yeah, so it's funny you say that because a few episodes on the podcast, we talked about that, how differences don't necessarily have to divide us and cause us to be opposing forces. So, as you already know, we talked about it at the beginning of this podcast. I'm on vacation right now, and as everyone knows, part of vacation is packing. So I was going through some boxes, trying to find something to throw in my suitcase before we came up here at my house, and I opened up a box, and there was a rolled up picture that I got my wife a while ago, and it's our wedding photo, and it has our wedding party in it, and it's a professional photo. It's rolled up. We just haven't framed it and put it up yet because we're waiting to buy a house. Neither here nor there. But I unroll it and I look at it, and it kind of takes me down a trip down memory lane. But as I'm looking at it, I realize that in this photo, we have males, females, members of the LGBT community, black, white, biracial, you name it. I mean, this was like, you name it. There was somebody in this photo, and we were all smiling. We were all having a good time, and we were all in the wedding photo. And I consider everybody in that photo family. But with that said, nowadays, and I don't know why this is the year, but we tend to, if Ryan has a disagreement with me, I tend to go, okay, well, that's it. Me and Ryan can't be friends. But we tend to forget that that's how we learn, right? Mm-hmm. Like, I have friends who hate the police, dear friends who hate the police, and I'm a police officer. But you know what I learned from them after having dialogues and conversations with them? Why they feel the way they do. And then what I could do is I could take that information and I could have a conversation with Ryan. And maybe Ryan could take something from that conversation, and then he could take it and use it on his platform. And then I could take it to the precinct, and I could go, hey, you know what? I have a buddy. He's not fond of the police. This is why he said he's not fond of the police. He had an experience, and during that experience, this police officer said this or did this. Maybe we should be a little more cautious doing these things. And that's how we learn. And the same thing with him. He hates the police, but he has a friend who's a police officer. And we have these dialogues. And maybe he learns something. When an officer walks up to the car at night, he's shining the flashlight at your lap or at your hands to see what your hands are doing. He's not shining it in your eyes. It's just a bright light.
I think
you're absolutely right.
Yeah, what we're seeing right now, I think, is that some actions, depending on which side you are on which issue, are so offensive and so egregious to some that they feel they have to stand up.
Yeah.
They have to fight, or they have to fight back. Look at politics alone. Some people are completely anti-President Trump, and some people are completely for. And I think that both sides feel that there are offenses said on both sides that make you not be in agreement or be comfortable seeing eye to eye or be comfortable even having friendships or chatting. And we've seen this in time and time before in other historical issues. I just watched a documentary on Roe versus Wade. And you remember, I don't know if you guys remember this, but there was a time where there were bombings of abortion clinics. So there was violence in other times because people felt so strongly about an issue that it led to them taking actions they felt they wanted to take to stop whatever it is. So we've seen times that have been this much of a clash before in this country, times of war, civil rights era.
So let me ask you this, Christine, because you've been, this kind of goes into maybe your history about why you even got into being a journalist and your road to becoming a journalist, but you've covered a lot of stuff over the years, I would imagine. Have you ever experienced in your lifetime anything of kind of what we're experiencing right now? Because it's almost like a perfect storm between COVID-19, the police, brutality and the uproar with that. Have you ever experienced so much at one time?
I think few of us have. Let's just talk about COVID alone. Who's been in a pandemic? Really?
Yeah, not me.
Nobody in my lifetime has been through a pandemic. So unprecedented times with that. What does that create? Fear, uncertainty, job loss, one of my foster sisters told me Friday she lost her nail business.
Mhm.
So I didn't know, lost her business. So there's a lot of fear right now. When are we going to have a vaccine? How long is that going to take? For example, my husband's a musician. His industry, 100% shut down, probably going to be one of the last ones to open up. So when does a paycheck? When does he go to work? When does he find something creative and passionate to do? How does he occupy his day? There's a lot going on with the pandemic. And then you think of those who are at a health risk. Is your grandmother afraid? Is your colleague elderly, perhaps with a health condition? I mean, a lot of fear right now.
So how do you balance that as a journalist? And is that, and correct me if I'm wrong, am I using the right term as a journalist? Because again, this is learning, and I want to make sure that not only am I learning, but our audience is learning. So as a journalist, how do you balance the level of fear, but at the same time being able to find those positive stories? Because one of the things that we get bogged down, and sometimes I even find myself sometimes at work, and AJ, I mean, he's been off for a little bit, but we deal with so much negativity. Yesterday we were talking about a briefing. We did there was a training about law enforcement suicide, because suicide for law enforcement officers is actually the number one killer for police officers. It's very, very sad. And we talk about the trauma and the tragedy that just goes in and day out. And then you kind of look back and you're like, okay, well, where could we have changed things? And I kind of look back and I'm like, well, did we try to match up as much of the traumas that officer were experiencing? Did we try to match a lot of positivity in that? And so yesterday, the same day, what I did is, so literally last week, I went on a drowning baby call where we got there and there was a 1-year-old baby that was face down in the jacuzzi. And that was the third drowning baby call I've ever gone on in my career. The family's devastated. I felt bad for mom, because mom is like, you know, she has 3 kids and I have 3 kids at home, and my wife is doing so much juggling acts just trying to make sure all my kids are where they're supposed to be. And so you can see just the distraughtness on her face, and the husband who was sleeping because he works graveyards, which I relate to because I've worked graves. And it was just a very bad situation. And so I remember praying for the family before I left there. I was praying with them and things like that. And this was actually a happy story, because at the end of the day, the baby was okay. They rushed him to the hospital. They were able to pump all the water out of his lungs, which was phenomenal. And then they said he woke up and he was singing the Mickey Mouse song. And, you know, and it was one of the best cries that you would ever hear, because he's okay. But I've been on 3 drowning baby calls, and that was the only one that's actually ever made it out. So what we did yesterday was, I told my team, I said, let's do this. I said, let's go over to the house. Let's give the little baby a Paw Patrol doll. Let's give the mom some flowers, because talking to her husband, she was like, yeah, she's been having a tough time with this. And then let's give the family a gift card to go eat dinner. But I bring that up because that was a way to turn trauma into triumph. And, you know, and how can we do that as members of, because we all have roles. I'm a police officer, AJ's a police officer, you're a journalist. We have our own individual roles outside of our careers in order to help our society and our communities out. So how could you or whoever else, what advice would you give our listeners out there to be the change that our country needs to see, as opposed to just feeding into the fear? Because there's a lot of people in fear right now because of COVID, and then, you know, the whole election. And so what other things can we do to basically stimulate positive change in our communities?
I always say that you can make a difference in a life. You don't have to make a difference to the masses. You need to make a difference to a life. You know, you have a platform and you've grown a platform. I have a platform as well, but people can make a difference by checking on their neighbor, visiting elderly relative, or in this day and age, Zooming with them or calling them or sending a food delivery over. There are a lot of ways to make a difference. There's no excuse for not being able to find a way to make a difference. And I think that people just set their goals to tap into what speaks to them. Like for me, certain things spoke to me. My parents were teachers, so education, inner city. I did get into some law enforcement causes as well. And I think that you find what speaks to you. Foster care fell into my lap, so we've done a lot of work with foster care. It doesn't have to be where you changing the world, change that world for one person. And then maybe they can change it for somebody else, and then it spirals.
Wow, that's a very good nugget, and I'll allow AJ to chime in a second. But I wanted to highlight on one of those nuggets. I was having a conversation with somebody yesterday, and they mentioned, he's a good guy, but he mentioned, man, if I had a platform like you, this is what I would do. And looking back at that statement, I'm like, you don't need to have a platform. You can do whatever you want to do right where you're at. And I think sometimes we get so distracted with the blue check. We get so distracted with the amount of followers that is like, well, I can't do that because I don't have that following, where we all have influence in a certain way. And I think we have to get away from that. Go ahead.
Not only that, it's probably a lot of work on your part to have your platform. You got to do all the social media postings. You have to do probably left your house to come do this.
I did.
So you're leaving your family, you're leaving your kids. So not everyone has to do all the things it takes to have a big platform. I mean, I've sacrificed a lot, missed family birthdays, family functions. I work a lot. Almost every Saturday I would be emceeing something. How many Saturdays did I miss going to a movie with a girlfriend who could have used this? So I don't believe that everybody has to serve mankind. I believe you can also serve man. And so
that's really good. I've never heard that before.
How much work you guys put into having this platform that you have, and what you're sacrificing also each time you step away from family or work or home or rest.
Well, AJ's doing it right now. He's on vacation in the mountains, but because we have a platform, there's a sense of obligation to the people that listen, and it's a good one because we've changed and we know we've impacted lives. But you're absolutely right. Is like, a lot of times people don't think of it from that angle, and it's so simplistic. You can go out there and just help the next person you see, and that right there can make waves because you don't know who that person is. That person could be the person that's going to change mankind. You don't know.
Exactly.
And the only reason they changed mankind was because your simple act of service to them that actually stimulated the change that they needed to see. And I think so we got to stop being distracted. And go ahead, AJ, because I'm going to turn it over to you because there's something else I want to go back to in a second.
No, you hit the nail right on the head with that. I'm a huge believer in the domino effect, right? Like, I wouldn't be who I am if it wasn't for somebody pushing me, being a domino, right? Like, if it wasn't for my mentor / really good friend coming into my life when he did, telling me what he did, pushing me towards my goals, then I wouldn't be where I'm at. I wouldn't have the platform that I have, reaching the people that I'm reaching and influencing the lives that I influence. And there's a saying, I'm not sure where it came from, but it's everybody wants to get to heaven, but nobody wants to die to get there. And that's exactly it, right? Like, people look at us and they're like, wow, if I had that platform you had, or if I had that influence. Well, you have to do what we do. You have to sacrifice time, and you have to, I'm on vacation right now and I'm recording a podcast, and, both of you are away from your families and loved ones right now because you believe in the message. And that's exactly it. Christina, I'd be curious to hear your input on this, and I'd be willing to bet I know what it is just because I've seen it and talked to a lot of journalists. Ryan, you brought up a really interesting point that I never really thought about. There's a friendly feud between firefighters and police officers. And the reason that is because we have shared trauma, right? We show up to a child that has drowned in a jacuzzi, relatively the same time. That's a joke. We show up first, they show up second, they're second responders, whatever. But we have shared trauma. And I never really thought about this, which would make me assume that a lot of other people haven't either, especially law enforcement, is journalists have the same shared trauma.
Wow, I never thought about that.
Because you have to respond out to that scene. You have to interview the family. You see the crime scene tape up. You see the body covered in the sheet. You see and experience a lot of these as well. But I'm curious why there's such a divide between law enforcement and journalists.
If there is a divide, and tell us if there. Do you think there's a divide? Because you may say, I don't think there's a divide at all. So that's a great question, a really great question. And I never even thought about it from that aspect, because you guys experience the same type of drama or trauma that we do in another, a difference, but you still experience some secondary trauma is what they actually call it.
Absolutely on the trauma part. But I think one huge difference is we aren't running into the line of fire. We aren't the first thing to try to revive the baby. We aren't there close up with the shooting and dealing with a victim and a crying family member. We kind of are a little bit after that. So I couldn't do what you all do. I did some officer training. All the journalists have done the simulation village. I also did a mini academy, and I realized I'm too afraid to go to that alley, and I am kind of afraid of this gun. And I did one training where I had to pat someone down, a big guy, and I did the pat down only to find that there was a weapon. I didn't find it, that I missed it, but there was a weapon under his sock, under his shoe.
Yeah.
Okay, not for me. And I did a domestic violence scenario too, where I went into the house and then the wife turned on us.
Mm-hmm.
There's a weapon in between the couch cushions. And so I'm like, yeah, not me. So you all have it in a whole different way. But yes, the trauma of doing crime scenes and interviewing grieving family members, working all strange hours of the night, working holidays, there is a relation that way. But AJ, to get to your question, why is there this divide? I think one thing is when you would interview somebody who had a grievance with police, whatever it is, they would give you an interview and tell their story.
Yeah.
For police, it's the very official news conference and often are waiting for the full investigation to facts, but you also aren't covering feeling. How officer feeling as they go home and talk to their child and their spouse. And I'm thinking there was one shooting after a pursuit where the pursuit ended and the guy got out of the car and he was shot and killed by police. And I knew through a friend that one officer at least lost his job. And I remember the guy getting out of the car had some herky-jerky motions. And was he a threat, though, to the officers, or were his motions so that they seemed to be uncertain? But whatever, I thought, how did that officer feel after killing somebody who did not have a weapon, who didn't appear to be posing a threat? I wonder. But we'll never, I'm sure that officer's not going to give an interview to the media.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of people fail to realize the process. And I'm sure you know this, when an officer is involved in something, we just can't get on the news and say, well, hey, this is what happened. This is how we felt. This is what happened prior to it. I know him, X, Y, and Z. Like, we have a protocol that we have to follow. And a lot of people forget that. And something that you just reminded me is a lot of police officers forget that as well, which may make us think that there's one-sided journalism or that journalists are playing favorites. But the reason that I asked that question is to remind our listeners and viewers the importance of relationships. I have relationships with journalists and reporters here. Therefore, when something happens, they can call me and they could go, hey, I seen this on the news. Is this normal protocol? Even if it's not local, right? Like, I have reporters, friends from all over. They could call me and go, hey, I seen this. And I could give them some insight without giving away too much and violating protocol or any of that. And vice versa, right? Like, if I see something on the news and I'm like, oh, wow, that kind of seemed a little off, I could call my friends inside and I could go, hey, I kind of seen this, and they go, well, this is going on, or this is why they said this, or maybe this is what they meant to say. And it's that simple, right? Like, you have two police officers on a podcast right now with a highly recognized journalist. And it's because we have relationships. And I feel that if police officers or people in general, especially in the year 2020, stepped out of their comfort zone and just had conversations with people, that we would be so much further in life than we are now.
Hey, what's going on, listeners? I want to take a quick second to give a shout out to our sponsors, Thin Line Anthem. Thin Line Anthem is a vitamin and supplement store started by first responders. If you're into fitness or looking to get fit during this quarantine time, check them out at thinlineanthem.com and use promo code ITSNEEDED, all caps, one word, and check at checkout. Thanks again, guys, and let's get back to the podcast. You just brought up, that point. I honestly, in all these years, have never even thought about that connection or lack thereof. From the standpoint of you, Christine, relating with people and seeing the emotional aspects of somebody that you're interviewing. Whereas I never forget, and me both AJ and I have been involved in critical incidents where we couldn't say anything. And one of the worst things about my critical incident, looking back at it, was after it happened, I couldn't talk to anybody. Like the only one I could talk to was my wife, and that's pretty much about it. And anytime somebody gets into something that's traumatic or whatever it is, what do the experts always say? You got to talk about it. You got to talk about it. You got to get it off your chest. But yet at the same time, but because of protocols, you can't. And for rightful reasons, because there's an investigation and all other stuff. But not even looking at it from your aspect, Christine, is whereas when you guys want to get information, we can't tell you anything. So there's no feeling or emotion that goes into it. Whereas you go interview a victim or somebody that's affected by it, they can give you everything because they're not bound by anything. And so there is a disconnect, and that's where we have to figure out. I think we're trying to figure out ways as law enforcement to evolve in our profession. I was having a discussion yesterday with somebody just talking about how we need to evolve in our profession. Like we've talked about this a gazillion times on this podcast about how law enforcement doesn't have a bright past, how there was a lot of racism involved in law enforcement in its initial roots. So we've talked about many of those things, but yet there's still a dire need for law enforcement. And so one of the hardest things for police officers to do in our profession, and AJ knows this, is to change. And so one of those ways to change is to have open dialogues. That's why I can't thank you enough to just be able to have these conversations, Christine, and being able to cover the dancing and things like that, because now you and I are able to develop a relationship. So that way, you know, I get to see journalism from a different perspective, just as much as you can see me as from a Ryan perspective, as opposed to Officer Ryan. You know what I mean? And so over the years, let me ask you this, Christine, what have been some of the challenges within your profession of journalism? And, you know, have you faced opposition, and what do you do when you face that opposition, whether it's internally or externally from the community?
Challenges in what way?
So challenges as far as like, are there stories that you want to cover, but you know, you can't cover or get shot down, or challenges that people are telling you from the outside, like, you guys only do this, when in your mind, you're like, no, we do a lot more than that, but this is what they only see. So they start casting judgment on you.
Well, let me just get back to one thing that was brought up earlier, versus CNN, Fox News, etc. I work for a local Fox station. I can tell you, I've never once been called into the office and said, do the story this way. Slant way or that way. Corporate wants it this way. So if people think we are leaning towards one perspective politically or another, I've never once been questioned on that or called on that or told to say something a certain way. I feel like we're strictly local news.
That's so good to know.
Very good to
know. Because I don't think you understand, like, for me, honestly, Christine, like, that's eye-opening to me in so many different ways. Because
100%.
Prior to this conversation, in my mind, it's all connected in one way or another. It's all connected. And so I think that's so important that you answer that, because you're going to open up a lot of other eyes, just like you did mine.
Yeah.
I've been at Fox 11 30 years coming up on. Right. And so, like I said, I've met corporate once, and that was at a banquet for an award. Wow. Christine, you must have started when you were like 20, though, because you only look like you're 30 years old.
I was just going to say.
So, you know, so here's the challenges are local news stories. The average story is about 2 minutes. So how much can you pack in 2 minutes? One, I've got to make a decision today. I interviewed some girls on investing. There are a lot of new investors with COVID, and I did a 10-minute Zoom with them. I got to boil that down to 2 minutes. So I'm like, do I want that angle or that angle? So there's that. Two, we're on deadline. So a story today, because we move so fast in news, might still be important and might still be relevant and necessary, but is it going to make your local newscast when you have a small handful of reporters? Keep in mind, LA, we have 5/8 TV stations, if you include the Latino stations. So that's 5 stations who have maybe a hour newscast to get all the day's news at the big planet. What are you going to cover with your handful of reporters? Somebody pitched me a story today. It's a great story. I can't tackle it because I don't have enough people.
Wow.
My people have to be on these stories, because those are the stories of the day. So then do you get response? Let's say it's a story that you want to get the other side. Do they call you back to give the other side? Do they give you a statement? Do they give you an interview? Do they say, we're not talking, no comment? And then that's all the coverage you can't weight your story 50-50 because that's all they will give you.
Oh, wow.
So there's that. What if you're late on the scene? You have limited time. It's kind of rushed.
Mm.
You do the best you can with as much accuracy as possible. Hopefully you have some worldly insight and you can provide at least some perspective. I think that if you watch a newscast, there is balance from the hard news to the community stories to the fun little feature with the cute little dog. We try to have a balance so it's not all, crime and violence.
No, I agree. And I think the unfortunate part is that people just don't know how to separate, what you see on the local news from what you see on a Fox coverage of the election or whatever it may be. Like, people don't know how to separate those two, and they kind of lump it all in the same thing. And they do the same thing for law enforcement, unfortunately. Like, they don't know how to separate, an isolated. So, for example, George Floyd was an isolated incident. That was what happened. What we saw with George Floyd, as it was unjustified. It was not, anything. I don't know. That was one of the first incidents I've ever seen in my profession where I don't know one law enforcement officer that tried to justify that. But if you take go ahead.
I think that the issue is other police matters / shootings that have made the news. I think it's other historical issues of, like, let's say Los Angeles's inner city community who had felt the police were an oppressive force. Think back to the days of NWA and the days of the 92 riots. Mm-hmm. It's not just, I think, people concerned about the officer.
No, and I agree. So I agree with that. So I know it's from a systematic standpoint. That was just a straw that broke the camel's back. But what I mean, as far as it being an isolated incident, what happened from that is a few weeks later, you had the Rashard Brooks in Atlanta, which that takes time and investigation because in that specific city, 2 weeks prior, they were considering the taser a lethal force. And then when he points at an officer as a lethal force, now all of a sudden it's no longer a lethal force. It's a less lethal option. So there's a lot of things. But because of that, they charge those officers almost immediately, which is not typical in our profession. So what I was saying is the isolated incident with the George Floyd is because that was the straw that broke the camel's back. Unfortunately, we reacted and started assuming that every single incident that happens in law enforcement is just like that when it's not, and there's so much more complex than that. And that's what I learned after I became a police officer, because this is coming from somebody who had no aspirations of doing it. Like I thought every single situation was like that in and of itself, but I learned, like, I just recently saw a shooting, and I'll end with this. I saw a shooting the other day that actually is out of Arizona. It was a domestic violence, and it was tragic. And the reason it was tragic because the guy basically called the police on his neighbor, said, hey, my neighbor is in there arguing with his wife. I can hear stuff being thrown up against the wall. I don't know if they're fighting, blah, 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 blah. So he put in multiple calls. The police show up to that house that he called on, and the owner of the house came to the door with a gun in his hand. And so on one end, the officer in front sees that officer with the gun, and the other officer is behind him, and he sees the gun in his hand. So you actually see the guy start to put the gun down, but it happens like so quickly, whereas the officer behind perceives it as a threat, doesn't realize that he just sees somebody coming out hot, like with a gun, and it ends up shooting and killing the guy. And so it looks tragic. It's terrible. But we had the advantage now, all of us, to slow that video down and look at it in slow motion. And as you look at it in slow motion, you can see that the guy's actually going to put the gun down. He's like, wait, and he's going to put the gun down. But those two officers, like the second and a half to perceive it and a second and a half to react to it, they didn't have that luxury. And so you have an officer now who's killed somebody, but to all of us, it looks tragic, and it looks like he killed somebody that didn't deserve to be killed. And so I bring that situation up is because there's so much that goes into investigations in these tragic situations involving police officers, that when you see a situation like George Floyd, a lot of the the society is like, hey, it's all like that. It's all corrupt when it's really not. And so I tie that back to the initial conversation is, you know, when people watch the news, they watch the local news of Fox 11 and they're like, oh, this is just another part of, you know, Fox that we see on, or CNN or whatever. And so we have to be able to get to a point where we treat situations for situations and be able to, you know, kind of pick those apart, but at the same time recognize where in the system can we make things better? Because like I said, there definitely needs to be change in law enforcement. We know that. I need to figure that out. But what ways can we do that within the relationships between the media and law enforcement as well? That was a lot. I know. I know. I kind of do that. Sometimes. And just so you know, and so our audience knows, I feel pressure every time I say anything. I feel pressure because this is a person that's always interviewing everybody else. So I feel a sense of pressure.
Yeah, there was an interesting twist in things, especially like the career in law enforcement after George Floyd, in many aspects, and just to keep things, you know, aligned with this episode of the podcast. One of those were the relationship with media, local media, national media. But I think a lot of officers were so emotionally involved and still are emotionally involved, to an extent, rightfully so, that we forget that it's exactly that. It's the news. You know, they're reporting the news. As you said earlier, you know, George Floyd was so egregious. It had to be covered. It absolutely had to be covered. And to the extent that it did, and it caused so many things to happen and such outrage that had to be covered. And then that caused change and demands from the community, which is news, which had to be covered. And the frustrating part, talking with like my friends who are like here in the local news, is now they feel attacked, right? Because, you know, I'm telling them what I'm hearing from the officers, and then I'm going back and telling them, and it just seems like a constant like argument back and forth. And I'm not sure if you're feeling that, you know, out in Cali, but I know we definitely are here. So I say that to ask you this, Christine, is if you could tell every police officer in the world something to help put their minds at ease during these times, what would it be?
Well, I think it's a very difficult time in this country. And I think it's a difficult time for your profession as there are for change. For example, the no-knock entry, that's been a tool that your industry has used that's become controversial and that's being looked at, and that can be debated. So I think in your industry, you all are looking at things that the community is saying, hey, this is causing a lot of harm beyond what we think is right. So your industry is going to be looking at different things. But how much of the calls for change does your industry go for, accept, and how much of the community is for all the specific calls for change?
Yeah.
Not everybody wants to defund the police.
Yeah.
Question is, are we also putting that voice out there as well? Because there is that voice as well.
Yeah.
I remembered I interviewed an LAPD captain who's in charge of employment and recruitment. And I interviewed him on diversity. And he has a panel where he's advised by some inner city veteran, solid community leaders. And I asked them all, raise your hand if you're for defunding the police. Not one of them was. These are all Black men, all leaders of the community, all advising the LAPD, and not one was for defunding the police.
Yeah.
Now, did other stations cover that story? That angle, I don't know. But I wanted to make sure that we had other voices. And that's, I think, something that I brought to the table, to let's hear from people who are maybe not out there with a protest sign, but very involved in the community.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
What leaders have to say. I mean, these are people who run some of the major organizations, and one was even former law enforcement himself. Now they want some change, they want reform, and they want diversity. And they've been advising LAPD for about a year. So I think it's about trying to get other voices and not cover easy voice, not cover, like, it's easy to roll up on a car accident and cover that.
Yeah.
But it takes time to do an investigation or to go out and knock on other doors and get other sides of stories.
Yeah. I tell you what, you have a hard job. You have an extremely hard job. And the reason I say that is you're darned if you do, darned if you don't. Right. And, I like to relate things to me. That way I'm not just saying things and people are like, oh, you can't say that. So I like to have some sort of, backing when I say things. I know me personally, I have gotten so many positive stories, so much positive interactions with the local news, national news. I've been on the news more times than I could count for good things, right? Whether it's with humanizing the badge, where we've been out to LA feeding the homeless communities, the news would come out and cover that. Whether it's dancing with kids, whether it's the things that I do here with the community on and off duty. But the moment that I started getting bad press, I automatically lumped everybody in the news field, journalists, reporters, into this bucket and went, you know what? They're out to get me. They're biased. So with that said, I would first like to apologize and admit fault because, I'm man enough to say I did it. I'm sorry. I talked to my buddies here and did the same thing. But I would also like to recognize how hard your job is. And I don't think many people do, right? Many people are just like, just report the news. It's easy. But when you report a shooting, then people are like, well, why are they in this community reporting the shootings and not out here? And then you go out here and report, and then you got this side mad at you. So I just want to recognize how hard your job is, and I want our listeners and viewers to recognize how hard your job is too. And thank you for doing it, because just talking to you, I've never seen one of your segments. I live basically on the other end of the country, but just by having this conversation, I could tell that your years of experience and your background, the way that you were raised, the hurdles that you've had to jump, have all put you in a situation where you can report as unbiased as you possibly can. And you tend to dig deeper into these situations to try to get the root cause of them. So thank you for that as well.
Well, I think that we are working really hard to have other sides. Like my co-anchor has a show at 7 p.m. and it might be the head of Black Lives Matter today and sheriff. Or if they'll go on at the same day, it's, both. So you have both. I mean, that to me is our goal, because it doesn't matter what I think. It doesn't matter what my co-anchor thinks. It's, are you letting both sides speak?
Yeah.
One of the things I'm going to talk to our law enforcement audience before we get ready to wrap it up is that, I'm always into solutions and how we can be better. And because a lot of our audience is largely law enforcement or, aspiring to be a police officer or a law enforcement officer in some capacity, one of the things I plead with you is continue to show that humanistic side to yourself, because that's what's going to help, not just change, your immediate environment, but that's what helps foster relationships like I have with Christine, like AJ has with the people, because we get to know each other on a personal level. And it's not just, and I know it's hard sometimes. I know we go through trauma, but people need to see that. And we can't always be so stonewall. We can't always be so hard. We have to be able to be a human being. I saw a video today where you see an officer and he's just acting like RoboCop, like no emotions, no anything. And it's like, you can't relate to people. They can't, there's no empathy in your approach to them. And so people need, yes, it's okay to be hard. Yes, it's okay to be tough guy, but people also need to be able to see soft guy. People need to also be able to see, like, you know what, I'm going to drop my guard and be human for a second, because think about it. I literally learned something today. Was I never even thought about it from the perspective that you gave, Christine, that you guys get to deal with people from their emotional standpoint. They can be open, but yet when you talk to police officers, we're just stonewall. And I get it. I understand why we have to, but that doesn't mean that you can't wear your emotions on your sleeve. And I think sometimes we get so caught up thinking that we can't wear emotions on our sleeve in this profession. But you know what? You can. And there's a time and place that when we were on that drowning baby call last week, the first thing I did once we got done is I checked on, hey, you okay? You okay? You okay? Let's talk about this. So that way, because the last thing I want you to do is go back into your turtle shell and just continue to foster these things up. So one last question for you, Christine. I could tell just based on who you are. I've done a lot of research, and like I said, I followed you ever since I was a child, and never knew I'd actually had the opportunity to interview Christine Devine one day. So, but what is it? All of us have something beyond just our media career. So I'm more than just Officer Ryan. AJ's more than Officer AJ. You know, my goal is to change the face of modern day policing. That's one of my goals when I leave the earth, is that I can say I was able to accomplish that. What is something that, you know, the day that Christine Devine is no longer with us on this earth, what is it, something that you want people, what do you want your legacy to be? And are you on track for that? And I know it's kind of a deep question, but I like to know it because that's, again, we go beyond, like, police work doesn't define Ryan Tillman. It doesn't at all. You know, I want all my work, everything I did, to define the dad I was, like you brought up about Kobe. I want the husband that I was to my wife, the dad that I was to my kids, the things that I did in schools. I want that to define me, not I carried a badge and a gun. So what would that defining moment be for you, Christine?
Can I just back up for one thing that kind of struck me that you were saying?
Please.
So I was doing a segment back, this was after the 92 riots, and it was called Good Cops. And I was talking to an officer, and he says, well, what is your definition of a good cop? Because if it's the officer who brings groceries to the neighbor down the street or the woman in the community, is that the definition of policing? Is that what a good cop is to you? And I thought long and hard about that, because I guess bringing groceries to somebody isn't really the definition of your job. Mm-hmm. So I think the challenge would be, people don't have to save the world, but I think when you're on the job, do you do it to the best of your ability to be, you know, as honest as possible, as skilled, as experienced, as trained, as just as possible? Then to me, you're a good human. I think that would be the challenge for officers, which is the challenge for me too. So that answers some you brought up earlier. But my goal, yes. Go ahead.
One second, because I want to. You strung a chord now with me. It's like a tennis match. So which is good. So your answer is phenomenal. And I was listening to a sermon by this pastor named Tony Evans yesterday, and he was saying something that actually, man, I was like, that's profound. He gave an example of, you know, going to, I think it was New York for the tree lighting ceremony, and he was there with his wife, and there was an officer there that, you know, he was like, the police officers are doing a phenomenal job controlling the crowds, this astronomical crowd size or whatever, and they're doing a great job. And so, you know, we went to, you know, this one officer to ask if we can get by to go see, because we couldn't see. And the officer was like, you know what, man, I am so sorry. I would love to have you go over there, but because of the time and because of the people, if I allowed you to do it, then, you know, everybody else. But if it was me, I just kind of going above and beyond. He was like, he was showing yes, but his answer was no. And then he was like, but then you go to there's another officer that, you know, you went to him and asked him the same question. He was like, no, and just in a rude manner, because of his job title, he was able to tell that person no. Because of the badge and the gun, he was able to tell that person no, just because of his title. But yet the other officer could have did the exact same thing because of his badge and the gun, just said no and kept going, but he went the extra mile. And that was the whole sermon, was like going the extra mile. So when we talk about this idea of good human and stuff like that, and officers, is yes, we can tell somebody no and just be like insensitive or whatever, because, you know, we don't really got to explain ourselves to people. But is that really making you a good cop? I think what makes a good cop is not necessarily taking groceries to the old lady. It's not necessarily taking the gifts to the family or the son that just almost died. It's going the extra mile even when you don't have to. Being able to explain things even when you don't have to. I always tell, anytime I have a stop with somebody, whether it's I pull somebody at a gunpoint, whether it's, you know, I just got done chasing them down, and whether it's I put hands on somebody, I go the extra mile to explain my actions and why I did it, so that way they can understand. Do I have to do that? No. And I think that's where we miss the mark sometimes, is I don't have to do it, therefore I'm not. I don't have to tell you why I did this, therefore I'm not. Which is, if you just went the extra mile, it can squash so many other things that we or problems that we have. So that just reminded me, that's what you said, Christine, just reminded me of what I heard yesterday, and I think it summed it up. So sorry about that.
I know too, you're not going to always have the luxury to give the time and the kind explanation. Sometimes your jobs move that fast.
Of course.
Yeah.
And I think that if I were an officer, I'd pray each day for my personal safety and that of my colleagues. I would pray for the wisdom and guidance to see things as accurately as possible. I would pray for the ability to judge things honestly and with safety in mind, and pray that each encounter is going to bring me home to my family, which I'm sure you guys do each and every day.
Exactly. So I appreciate it. So now back to what's the defining moment? What will be the defining moment for Christine Devine?
It's such a hard question right now because I've been so 24/7 work with the coronavirus. And I feel like every project I was doing that was on the side to empower other people and young people and embrace young people has really been backburnered because of the necessity to cover the day's news. So I might have to defer that question to another time. Right now, I think I'm trying to get through the coronavirus pandemic. We've got a lot of tough issues right now when it comes to employment and the economy. We've got an election year coming up. So I think if the legacy would be one that brought other voices to the table, that brought other voices on air. I'm not the person who needs to interview the celebrity or the person with a ton of followers or the top politician. I want to hear the community voices. So I can't go out in the community right now and do all the nonprofit work and the speaking and being involved and helping out because of the virus. But I can tell some of their stories on the air. I can bring some of their voices. People who would maybe never get to be on TV or never get heard or never asked what they think or what they feel.
And I just want to thank you, and I'll leave you, AJ, with your last comments. But I Christine, again, I just want to thank you because what you just said, I can vouch that that's what you've done. That's what you've done for me. That's what you've done for people I know. And I think that's so important. I think sometimes people get all caught up with the glitz and glamour and who I'm interviewing, this and that. And sometimes it's not always about that. A lot of times it's getting to be the voice of the community. So if there was one thing that if for whatever reason you took your last breath tomorrow, I would honestly be able to stand up and say, you know what, she was a voice for the people, honest, like a true voice for the people. And I appreciate, I want to put that out in the open. Like, I appreciate that. And it's not just because you've covered me the last couple years. It's because I've seen you throughout the years as a child growing up. My parents, we've all watched you, and I know that to be true. And so if there's any officer or anybody out here that is listening to this podcast today, just know that just like law enforcement, we all have to see beyond the profession that people do and see the human side of it. And just know that there's real people out there trying to do what's right, and Christine Devine is one of them. So go ahead, AJ. I'll let you give your final thoughts, and then we'll wrap up with our sponsor.
Yeah. So if I had to put into words the lesson that I learned during this episode of the podcast, it would be to practice what you preach. And the reason I say that is, as a police officer, and being friends with police officers from all over the world, I would say a lot of times we feel that we're constantly attacked by somebody else's actions, right? Well, I didn't kill George Floyd. Why is everybody mad at me? I didn't do whatever's on the news. Why does everybody feel that way about me? They didn't do their research. They didn't know this. They didn't know that. But in the same breath, we tend to attack other people. And, once again, I'll speak personally when we see something on the news. Well, they don't know the full story. Why'd they do that? And we lump them all into the same. And, with that said, thank you so much, because you taught me a valuable lesson, because I'll be upfront with you. I thought that, a lot of these calls came from the top. This is how you're going to report it. This is when you're going to report it. This is how much time you're going to give this person. And you debunked that for me. So if I had to break this down into the simplest terms, it's practice what you preach. Whether you're a police officer, whether you're a civilian, whether you're a journalist, whether you're whoever, practice what you preach. Don't only apply it when you're emotionally involved, but it's every single day.
I think that was well. And also I would just say, just a reminder that for everybody, life is really hard. I used to think it should be great and easy and wonderful. And I had a mentor who say, no, life is hard. And so I think that if we can do the best we can on a daily basis, always seeking wisdom from other people, always being willing to listen and learn. And like, I view everybody as my teacher, pro or con, friend or foe. Everybody is my teacher. And that's how I live my life.
Christine, can't thank you enough. You've been phenomenal. I appreciate, again, I keep saying it over and over, but people, when you did your last story on me, people saw it. And I think it just helps my voice and my heart of really what my passion is changing the way people view law enforcement in the profession. So you give me a voice to do that. And you've given so many other people that voice. So however we can help in any way, if any small way, because I can't say we're anything major, but if we can, we're all about it.
Well, I was surprised, actually, you gave me the interview, which was about your thoughts and feelings about the protests and being out there as an officer. I reached out to about 10 different people. Some would say, yes, I'll share my thoughts. Others weren't ready. And I think back in the day, officers would not have shared their feelings or thoughts on something like that. And, you all tend to want to remain the officer with the profession and the uniform. And I understand that. So I thought it was eye-opening, and I thought it was an important voice.
Well, that's the only way we're going to be able to change. If we want the community to feel for and understand what we're going through, then we have to be able to allow them to feel that. And the only way to do that is to share our feelings from a humanistic standpoint. And so that's why I did that, and that's why I will continue to do that. I promise all of our listeners and viewers that I will continue to just be me, be Ryan. I tell people all the time, like, Ryan Tillman is more than a badge and a gun. So I'm an open book, and I think that if there was ever a situation involving me on the news or the headlines or whatever, I want enough of the work that I've done prior to. I want you guys to judge me based on that work as opposed to that situation. So that's it. So thank you so much. If you guys are like this podcast, please continue to give us a 5-star rating, 5-star review. It helps push us up in the standings. This podcast is setting records. I'm not even lying when I say that, but we are setting records. We are getting hit up. We're getting sponsors that are reaching out to us, and it's only because we have phenomenal listeners like yourself. So if you do like this podcast, please give us a 5-star rating, 5-star review. Check us out on YouTube. You'll also be able to see on there, and also leave comments, because that's how we understand what to do better, what you guys like and what you guys don't like, because ultimately we want to get better as an organization. So thanks again, guys, and we'll see you guys next week.
Peace.
What's going on, everyone? This is Billy, or as Ryan and AJ like to call me, the Savage. I'm here to tell you about the Thin Line Anthem Transformation Challenge. This is an 8-week fitness challenge starting August 3rd. There are 3 things you need to do to enter. These instructions will also be pinned at the top of our private Facebook group in a post if you need to go look at it later. The 3 things to join are: 1. Subscribe to our It's Needed email list. 2. Join our private It's Needed Facebook group. 3. Buy a Thin Line Anthem product. 4. Send in a before photo holding your Thin Line Anthem product to itsneededpodcast@gmail.com. Comparing the before and after photo is how we will choose the winner. All the links needed for these steps are in the show notes, and again, detailed instructions and links will also be pinned at the top of our Facebook group. Thin Line Anthem has let us know they will be giving a $200 gift card to the winner. We will be giving away some free merch, and plus being healthy is just good for everyone. So remember to get your product and send in your before photo before the start date of August 3rd.